audio. And that's what you're listening to it for. So we don't need this going on right now. I like to run them from a flash drive, because sometimes these old computers will seize up if you try to, let me get a roll up, if you try to record a Tegrity file at the same time you're online with Blackboard pulling the PowerPoint off of Blackboard, off of the class's Blackboard site. And so let's see. Okay, so this is section 002, September 18th. $2015. Okay. So let me pass around a roll. Now, our first test is a week from this coming Wednesday. So this Wednesday, I will give out a sheet of take-home essay question options for you to choose one and bring to the test a week from Wednesday. And you want to also be looking to get your Scantrons if you haven't done so. 3 of them. The little green one, not the bigger red one. I think the number is 882. So, actually, we have the tape running now. So Aristotle and moral virtue. Well, we'll see that for Aristotle, acting virtuously is achieved when we basically use our rational abilities, use our reason to control our lives. We're going to see that he sees us as essentially rational animals, as reasoning beings. And so Aristotle looks at virtues as areas where we use our reasoning. Now, we're not going to look at his concept of intellectual virtues, but Aristotle was a scholar with a number of interests. He wrote in fields like botany and physics. Now, of course, Aristotle's physics isn't going to look anything like the physics text you used in high school. But he wrote in other areas, so he thought part of what we ought to be about as human beings is learning more intellectually about the world around us, and so this was for him to develop intellectual virtues. But we're going to focus on Aristotle's concept of a moral virtue. And for Aristotle, as for Plato before him, moral virtues had to do more with what kind of person we ought to be if we're to be a moral person, if we're, rather than what we ought to do. And so Aristotle, as for Plato before him, focuses on character traits. We're not going to look at Plato's view of what a human being is, but he thinks that a human being, is his or her makeup, is really composed of 3 different parts: a rational part, an emotional part, and a part having to do with the desires of our lower nature, of our body for food, drink, sexual fulfillment. And so for Plato, we develop, say, a character trait of self-control in the area of food and drink by allowing the rational part of us to rule over what he calls the appetitive part, the part having to do with our appetites. You know, in other words, when we allow reason to rule and keep in check our tendency to want to eat too much or drink too much, then we develop the virtue of self-control or temperance. And Aristotle has a little bit of a different picture of what the virtue of temperance looks like, but he's in the same vein, that it's a character trait that's developed when we rightly use our reasoning abilities. And so, you know, we develop a character trait like courage for Plato if we use our reason to keep in control where our emotions might take us. And it's the same for Aristotle. So Aristotle, we're going to see, thinks that we can develop virtues, virtuous character traits, even if we don't have them. And often, for Aristotle as for Plato, we have to, in developing virtuous character traits, act against the tendency, act against where our natural tendencies would take us. And I'll say more about this when we get started. So for Aristotle, developing a virtuous character trait is done over time by exercising our rational abilities to control ourselves. I have something on the blackboard here to my left. Developing a virtue or a virtuous character trait for him, it's kind of a cyclical thing. In other words, let's say you're trying to develop more assertiveness, more courage, say. Well, for Aristotle, you develop a virtuous character trait by first choosing to act or perform actions in accordance with the virtue you're trying to develop. So if you say, well, you know, I need to become a more assertive, more courageous person. Well, okay, so I'm going to try to make decisions that are in line with that. Trying to be more courageous in the decisions that I make. Or if you're trying to develop self-control, you say, well, I need to exercise more control over my tendency, say, to overeat. So if you don't have the character trait, you develop it from performing actions which are in line with that character trait. If you're trying to develop courage, you perform courageous actions. And then over time, you develop a certain character trait or character disposition of, say, being a more courageous person or being a person who has his, tendencies to overeat and control. But then it's it kind of comes full circle. In other words, having over time developed within you the moral virtue of courage, it then becomes easier in the future to act courageously, to act in accordance with a character trait that you've developed. Or if you're trying to develop self-control or temperance in the areas of food and drink, if you've over time developed the virtue of temperance or self-control, then it becomes easier in the future for you to make decisions in line with that, to say no to that extra dessert or whatever. So, for Aristotle, we acquire virtues in the same way that somebody requires a skill. My dad, when after World War II, was working as a painter for a while. I mean, like a house painter, not a artist-type painter. And it was bothering his lungs. He was having problems with asthma. And so since he was a World War II veteran, my mother suggested that he go back and learn a different trade under what was then the GI Bill. In other words, with the government picking up the tab for veterans. And so we went back and learned carpentry. And, you know, which is a learned skill. Now, there can be some innate talent, right? If somebody's a master craftsman, you know, they might be able to build, you know, make a guitar or build a really beautiful piece of furniture better than somebody else. But it was a skill he learned, and I have in my living room, even today, a knick-knack shelf that my dad made when he was in carpentry school. In other words, how do you learn a skill like learning to build things as a carpenter? Well, you do it over time by exercising those skills. And this was a way he exercised and became better at building things by, you know, developing that skill. Similarly, to play a musical instrument, pianos were not around. By the way, did anybody notice the piano player in that video there? It goes by quick. No, I said I thought they were a little over the top. I mean, after about the second or third time, you want to say, oh, okay, I get it. Developing a virtuous character trait is like developing a skill like playing the piano. Okay, do we have to cut to this guy another half a dozen times in the video? But at any rate, musical instruments like lyres were around in Aristotle's time. And so he knew that in order to become a skilled musician, you have to practice, right? You don't go over the library behind us, take out a book on, you know, learning to play the piano, go home and read it on a Friday night, and on Saturday night go and, you know, play a set of music at the local nightclub, you know, on the piano. No, you have to develop that skill over time. And so we become just or virtuous persons. We develop virtuous character traits by, as I said, first performing those actions, and they develop certain character traits or dispositions to act in a certain way with us. Now, Aristotle's a very practical guy, right? For him, say, developing a virtue like courage is not achieved as if you were some mystic. where you say, well, okay, I want to become more courageous. Oh, my son, go off to the mountain and meditate on courage. And when you come down, you will become a more courageous person. No, that's not what Aristotle's saying, right? That's not how you develop courage for him, right? You know, forget Yoda, right? I mean, basically, you develop courage is by making courageous choices in your interactions with other people, right? So virtues are developed in our social interactions with others, not, by private meditation. We do not become morally just in isolation. We become morally just by performing just acts in our transactions with other human beings. Okay? To move on. Now, this is a very important slide. It gives you his general model for what a virtue should look like. In other words, we said that philosophy in its critical function may have a negative part where we might examine some of our basic concepts and either abandon them as wrong-headed or want to revise the definitions we have. And so Aristotle says, you know what, I think I can do better in defining what a moral virtue is than the people who have done philosophy before me, even my teacher Plato. And by the way, I mean, Aristotle was far and away Plato's most brilliant pupil, and by rights he should have succeeded Plato in the academy, in Plato's school of philosophy, but he and Plato didn't see eye to eye on everything, and so interdepartmental politics came into play even 2,500 years ago. So Aristotle basically had to go off on his own and found his own school of philosophy. So here we have Aristotle's concept of what a moral virtue should be. And it's in line with some other things that were prevalent in Greek society when I was in high school. At Polytechnic, I had an English teacher named Carl Yunt who taught as much philosophy as English. And we were also, besides talking about Greek philosophy, we're reading some Greek plays by people like Aristophanes. And I wrote a book, I read a book at the time by, I believe it was by a scholar named Edith Hamilton called The Greek Way, if I recall that correctly. And she talks about the golden mean, a mean, of course, being a midpoint, as a really guiding principle in Greek society. That is, that to them, the moderate life was the best life in a lot of areas. Moderation in all things. Now, your author kind of says he doesn't totally mean that, and there are some virtues where you can't have too much of them. That's true, but basically this is Aristotle's model, and it sees a virtue not as what you see here, not as something that is the at the opposite end from a vice, right? So it's one or the other. But for Aristotle, the virtuous course of action is following the moderate midway point between two extremes, both of which are vices. So a virtue is the midpoint between two vices. In other words, for Plato as for Aristotle, it's not a good thing to totally deny the needs of our body for food and drink, as, say, an Eastern mystic might do. Say, you know, all I need to do is go off and meditate and I can live off of air. Okay, you know, good luck. No, for Plato, to be an ascetic is as bad as being a glutton or a drunkard, you know. And so for Aristotle, then, a virtue is the midpoint between two vices, a vice of deprivation, too little of something, and a vice of excess, too much of something, you know. It's being in what we would say today is the Goldilocks zone, right? Was it porridge that was too hot, none which is too cold, but something that's just right. And so, I mean, take temperance as an example. In other words, self-control in the area of fulfilling the needs of our body for food and drink, and for Plato, even sexual fulfillment. Well, for Aristotle, it's the mean between totally, that word is asceticism, it's really a point of view that would deny the needs of your body for, say, food and drink. It's the midway between the extreme of deprivation, depriving your body of these things, or you know, excess, going to excess and becoming a glutton or a drunkard. But it's following the midway course of action. Likewise, courage. My dad, as I said, went through World War II. He was a bombardier and navigator on a, I guess, a B-17 or B-29, at any rate. It seems like people who went through that war were either like my dad. My dad never talked about his World War II experiences. Or they were like my Greek professor in college. Now, he was not Greek, but I mean, I took the Greek language then. And he would pepper his lectures with anecdotes from World War II. And remember, when I was going to college, say in 1970, well, World War II was over in 1945. You know, so we're talking 25 years. There were still a lot of people around who had gone through that war. And I remember one anecdote he said. He apparently was kind of maybe a non-commissioned officer, and he was leading a group of soldiers. And he says they got into their unit a new 18-year-old from the States. And one day they got into a firefight with the Germans. You know, they were shooting at one another, right? And so this kid who's totally green decides, I'm going to do what they do in the movies, you know, and he decides he's going to just stand up and start shooting at the Germans. And, of course, he doesn't understand how good they are, you know, and these are veterans who can pick him up, and he ends up getting shot himself. Well, you know, for Aristotle, that's not necessarily courageous behavior. That may be just foolhardy behavior. You know, how many of you, if you drive, have been driving down the expressway? I drive down the expressway, and sometimes I'm going maybe 5-7 miles over the speed limit, right? And then I have somebody pass me on a motorcycle or one of these trail bikes, like, vroom! like I'm standing still, weaving over lanes. It's like, okay, good luck. Hope your tires are in good shape, Hope you don't hit a slick spot on the road. I mean, that is a little foolhardy, right? If they'd ever wiped out on the motorcycle, I mean, folks, having a reasonable degree of intelligence does not insulate you from doing stupid stuff, especially when you're a teenager, I have one of the other things my Greek professor used to say is youth is the time when you can make all your mistakes and not have to pay for them now. I still get a pain in my left shoulder from trying to race Charles Jockle through San Martin Drive, which is a road that goes like this. It's by John Hopkins. And he knew the road better than I. He's probably a better motorcycle rider. And he went through okay, and I wiped out on my Honda, At any rate, to get back to what my Greek professor said, he basically, said that this kid got shot. Now, for Aristotle, having no fear, like that kid, or like the person who's zipping by, weaving in lanes at 90 miles an hour on the expressway, is not necessarily courageous. It might be simply foolhardy. Likewise, we know that having a total fear of something is not courageous, but sometimes we don't talk about the excess. So for Aristotle, it's developing courage is not feeling no fear, but it's controlling the fear you have, right? This, again, is developing this contrary to nature. You say, I need to become a more assertive person. I need to develop, more courage in my dealings with other people. You know what? The person I work with just got a raise, and they've been here about the same time. Why am I still working at what I'm working for? I need to go in and talk to my boss about a raise. But that's not what you want to do. You got to work against your natural tendency is to say, well, no, maybe I don't really want to go in there and confront him. But developing courage is often developing contrary to nature, right? You're sitting there studying, and you had a piece of chocolate cake for dinner, and you're saying, I know I want to really control my weight better and my appetite, but that chocolate cake is sitting there over there in the refrigerator. I feel like I could use another piece of that cake. Well, what your nature is telling you is have another piece of chocolate cake, but you're saying, well, I would have developed more self-control in this area, so you're fighting your natural tendency. And how do we do this? Aristotle says it's by using our reasoning abilities. For him, the use of reason is very important because it has to do with our essential human nature. For Aristotle, the essence of a thing, the essential nature of a thing, is frequently defined by its function. In other words, the essential nature of a pen is that it's an implement designed for writing on paper, right? The essential nature of a piece of chalk is that it's a product built for writing on a blackboard. Likewise, take a knife. The essential nature of a knife is that it's an instrument designed to cut things with, right? Now, For Aristotle, the Greek word arete, A-R-E-T-E, transliterated, is the word used in Greek for virtue, but it also applies to inanimate objects that perform their function well. In other words, the excellence of a thing is its arete, its virtue. Now, if we were fixing dinner together and I said, you know what, I need to cut through this chicken bone. Hand me that knife over there. It's a really virtuous knife. You would look at me like I was from the moon, right? Say, what do you mean by a virtuous knife? But for Aristotle, the same word used for virtue also applies to a knife or another inanimate object that performs its essential function well, excellently. So this concept of virtue has to do with living an excellent life, a good life. However, we do have both moral and non-moral senses of the word good, right? In other words, we talk about somebody being a morally good person, having good character, or whatever. But we also talk about good in a non-moral way. I mean, you know, if I said, well, hey, you know, this is a good little light here because it's very bright, you know, if you're looking for some. Or likewise, it wouldn't be unusual at all for me to say, well, I need to cut through this chicken bone. Hand me that knife over there. It's a really good knife to do something with. In other words, we do talk about a good knife, right, as a knife that does what? It performs its essential function of cutting well, right? You know, if we talk about a pen as a good pen, we mean it writes well. So to get back here, you can say, well, what is the arete, the virtue? What is human excellence bound up with? Well, for Aristotle, it's bound up with our performing our essential function as a human being. And usually the essential nature of a thing is something unique to it, right? You know, if I need to cut something, using a piece of chalk is usually not going to cut it in the most literal sense, right? It's not a good implement to use. You know, but unique to a knife is that it cuts things well. So to find out our essential nature as human beings, and so here Aristotle is adding to the definition of what a human being is, he says we need to ask what is unique about us as human beings, something that isn't shared by the other life forms on Earth. And I have a diagram in the next slide that gets this out. But he says, well, look, plants have life in them, and that's what separates them from a rock or a stone. Is our function, our essential nature, having life? Non-human animals have both life and an emotional life. So is it having an emotional life that makes us unique as human beings? Well, Aristotle says no. Yeah, he says that what separates us, what allows us to draw a sharp line between us and the rest of life on Earth is that we are rational reasoning beings. We can understand the steps in an argument or a mathematical proof, or we can control our behavior using our reason. So he says our essential nature can't be having biological functions because even, you know, plants and non-human animals have those. If we're talking about sentience, Unless we're talking science fiction, plants don't have an emotional life, right? But non-human animals do. So Aristotle says it can't be just having an emotional life because we share that with non-human animals. But for Aristotle, we can draw a sharp line between us and non-human animals at reasoning abilities. Now, after Darwin, this view, the waters got very muddied here, right? For Darwin, the difference between human reasoning abilities and the abilities of, say, higher primates, of non-human animals, is a difference in degree, not in kind. There's just a degree to which our reason exceeds the reason of dolphins and chimpanzees and what have you. But for Aristotle, he thought we could draw a sharp line at our ability to reason. So our reason is what gives us our essential function, and so living human excellence then is bound up, and developing virtues is bound up with our using our reason, and it's using our rational abilities that enables us to walk the mean between extremes. Using our reason to keep in check our natural tendencies to go to excess or to go the other way. Now, what is the end of morality? For Aristotle, it's something very practical. For Aristotle, moral goodness is defined in terms of human happiness. For Plato, it was defined as the sun outside the cave represented for Plato the form of the good. In other words, the ultimate standard for moral goodness in a separate world. Aristotle didn't think that absolute standards for things existed in a separate world. So for Aristotle, moral goodness is not defined in terms of some ethereal form of the good in some unseen realm, but it's human happiness, or eudaimonia, which is broader than just a happy feeling. It's more kind of an overall sense that life is good, that you're living a good, well-balanced life. So happiness, then, he says, is an activity, and it's desirable for its own sake, not for the sake of something else. In other words, Aristotle thinks that everything else that might be good is only good because it promotes some other end, but happiness is something that we desire not because it promotes some other good, but for its own sake. Now, I'm not going to get into how he establishes that, but for us, to be happy is to act virtuously. It's to, happiness for him is activity in accordance with virtue. To do noble and good deeds are desirable for their own sake. So Aristotle is going to try to convince us then that the virtuous life is also the happiest life for a human being. And that essentially happiness is the payoff for a morally virtuous life. And at this stage of the game, I don't know if I would have bought this when I was your age, but when I look back, the kinds of people that seem to be the happiest people I know, the people who seem to think life is basically good, are the kinds of people who are following kind of a mean of moderation, who aren't going to excess either way, but are living a well-balanced life in various areas. So the happiest life then is a life of moderation. Virtue then is walking the moderate mean between extreme, and so the happiest life for him is the virtuous life, which is the moderate life. And that's the end, folks.